The Broad Perspective Network is not responsible for the content of the following program. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Broad Perspective on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Kamori.
I'm Donovan Hurd.
I'm Greg Barnes.
I'm Kevin Lawson.
And I'm Laura Felice.
And we have a full house today and a lot to talk about, but we wanted to kick it off with speaking about an issue that's happening in Japan. And there's a growing trend in Japan of elderly women deliberately committing petty crimes, hoping to get caught so they'll get sent to prison. Well, hasn't that just crossed all of our minds? Well, and there have been times in my life where it probably has. But it goes on to tell a story about Mrs. F. was 84 years old the first time she was ever sent to prison. Her crime? Petty shoplifting. She stole rice, strawberries, and cold medicine. She served her time, got released, and shoplifted again so she'd go back to prison. She's 89 years old now, serving out another 2.5-year sentence, not too far away. Well, I'll leave that sentence out because it's close to where the writer was writing this article, but it was at a women's prison 60 miles outside of Tokyo. 1 in 5 female prisoners in Japan is a senior, almost all of whom have been convicted of petty crimes like shoplifting. It's no accident. Elderly women in Japan are economically vulnerable. Half live below the poverty line, many live by themselves, and they have no one to turn to for help. This is a sad state of affairs. This is Japan. Now, keep in mind, Japan was booming economically back in the 70s and the 80s?
80s.
Yeah.
Even part of the 90s.
Right. And that's all changed now. So the tides have turned, and these women, because they otherwise, I'm assuming, don't have a place to be or go or to be fed, so they're spending their time in prison. Now, the question I have, well, I have a lot of questions, but is how far are we from that same scenario, and why is it any different in Japan than it is right here with us now? And well, go ahead, Greg, jump in there.
I just want to say that what sparked my interest with this whole article is that it gives us a chance to try to grasp the understanding of how important it is for people to understand economic history, just in general. You don't have to know all the particular details, but you should always know a broad picture of economic history. And this article, the reason why all this is happening, what is our current state of affairs, and other examples like Greece, Venezuela, Italy, Hungary for that matter, they're all perfect pictures of different stages of economic evolution.
And they are. And keep in mind that I think Japanese life expectancies tends to be a little longer than ours, and Japanese women even more so. And they do tend to live into their late 80s, 90s, even into the hundreds. But I guess at what expense? Now, I suppose it's its own kind of welfare. I don't know how the Japanese government is structured on welfare, but for people that don't have a place to be or to go, maybe this is what they feel is their only option. And I just think it's very interesting and something for us to pay attention to. Now, also the other thing that's happening is that the population in Japan, the older population, is growing rapidly. The younger people are not reproducing. They're not having children nearly like... They're not reproducing themselves. Yeah, replacing themselves, I guess you'd say. And the birth rate has gone down drastically. So there's major changes afoot, and I think the same thing is probably happening in this country.
Well, I think we should take a step back now and just review a little bit of economic history of Japan to put all this into context. In the late 70s and 80s, Japan experienced an economic powerhouse of an explosion of their economic abilities, mostly because it had become very trendy to buy Japanese parts. The psychological marketing had extreme success to having people that anything from Japan was going to be meticulously, accurately, and dependably better than anything made in the United States.
Exactly, that's true.
And the world ran with that. And as a result, they became very strong economically.
Yes, they were a superpower.
Yes, a financial superpower. But at the same time, their central bank was doing exactly what our central bank and other central banks around the world are doing, which is inflating assets through creating more money to fuel all of this. They were literally just creating cheap money to build all these corporations, to build all these parts to sell to the rest of the world. And the big problem was is everyone thought that would last forever. And that's what happened in the 90s, is that party came to a standstill. The euphoria that the world had about everything being perfect from Japan finally wore off. The hopium, the high that everyone was getting from this wore off, and everybody changed their habits. And that crashed the Japanese economy.
Exactly. And I don't know, I think we're not of similar age. I know I'm the oldest one in the room. But prior to everything being made in Japan being a quality product, back in the 50s and even the 60s, made in Japan, that's crap. That was the reputation that it had for anything that was made in Japan at that point, at that time, and up until that time, was thought to be of lesser value. And I have to give them a lot of credit. They hunkered down. They started really thinking about this and producing a good quality. So then the reputation became, it was the premier quality product because it was from Japan. And that's how quickly they turned things around, which I think is admirable. But they got into that cushy lifestyle that we Americans have now as well. And it changed everything. And people, once you've had that, it's really hard to give that up. I think you get accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and it's hard to go from living in a home to living in a tent on the street or what have you. It's hard to move down. It's easy to move up. It's hard to move down, and I think that this is taking so many of the demographic there in Japan by surprise. And what's happened too is Japan has learned to live on debt, which we in the United States are very familiar with, and I think somewhere in this article it said that 20 or 30% of their revenues is going to pay for debt, and I'm like, okay, well that's pretty good actually, because in this country I think really about 100% now we're at a point where we're going to need to be putting forward to pay for our debt. So I don't know, but I know that the Japanese central bank started doing quantitative easing. They were printing money, and the world of course accepted it because they were a superpower. And so now things are changing, and unfortunately, it trickles down to the people.
If they're living off of just debt, then how is it possible for them to ever generate revenue on debt money?
Well, why don't you ask an American? We've been doing it for quite a while.
Well, here's the technical answer.
Yeah, go for it.
And the technical answer is that capitalism, by definition, is a debt-based monetary system. For it to survive, it has to always create more debt in the next fiscal year than it had the year before for it to even continue to go. This is the reason why in a capitalist society there never is a balancing of the budget. This is the reason why the United States has not had a legitimate balanced budget in over 12 years. We are under the facade that we're functioning like a normal corporation that is going to, have good accounting and everything's positive and the whole nine yards. But the fact is you keep hearing us talk about stealing the wealth from our grandkids. This is because we're spending into the future. Right. We're kicking the can down the road, and the debt can never be paid.
But we've always been doing that. I remember my mother saying when she was a little girl that every household, because she remembers saying to her mother as a kid in grade school, there was a statistic that came out that said every person in the United States was in debt to the tune of like $80. Every citizen in the United States had an $80 debt on their back. And I remember my mom saying, she told her, Grandma, can't we pay that? Can't all of us save up our money and pay that $80? And And so now, which at the time, that would have been nice, That would have been nice if everybody could have paid their $80. I know that somehow I'd go out and collect soda cans and maybe collect $80. But now the debt for every single person is something that's totally incomprehensible.
I have
None of us
that
could do.
number for you. if
Would you
like.
please give us that number?
It's
Yes.
approximately $58,000
There you
per
go.
person as soon as you're born.
Man, woman, and child.
Man, woman, and child. Immediately you're born into a $58,000 debt. This is the reason why we have to pay taxes, is because the Federal Reserve loans money to the United States using the people of the country as collateral. This is the reason why we have to pay taxes.
Well, another interesting comment in this article, which, by the way, is written by Simon Black, and he's a very well-known economist and world traveler. It says the Japanese government has to borrow appalling amounts of money in order to make ends meet each year. The national debt there has become so large that it's more than twice the size of the Japanese economy. And I'm thinking, okay, that sounds like nothing compared to us.
You're right.
And
You're right.
what's ours times the national economy? Do you know, Greg? if
Our
you're good with
national
numbers?
economy, which is called the gross national product, gross domestic product, let me get that right, is approximately $3.3 trillion every year.
Okay.
And we owe approximately $500 billion in taxes on that debt. I'm sorry, on the $20 trillion national debt that we owe.
Okay, so we got a $20 trillion debt, and what is our GDP?
$3 trillion.
$3 trillion. Okay, so that's worse than Japan's, because 3 into 20, that's almost 7 times.
Yes.
We've got almost 7 times. Okay.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, well, so go ahead, Laura.
So wasn't 1933 the year they started collecting taxes from citizens? Was that the year?
No,
that
it
they
wasn't
did
1933. The IRS was created in 1917, but it wasn't until in 1935 when they created the Social Security Act. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the Child Support Act is what it's called. It's where Social Security was created, which allowed them to track every individual. That's when they started to collect taxes through your Social Security.
So what did we do before all this? I mean, how did things get paid for before the government collected tax from citizens?
Well, we've always had a taxation system, but it was always indirect taxes. There wasn't. Let me try and get this right here. You've heard the phrase "the taxation without representation." Okay. It depends on what part of this country's history we have to talk about, because taxation has come and gone and then been reestablished, and so we're actually in a third era of an income tax. And I can't think of I can't think of it right now, but what I'm trying to say is that what we did in the past, because that's what your question is everything was more on a voluntary system. Public roads and all those things were funded by the states. And so we paid state taxes, but we weren't paying federal taxes.
Income tax.
Income taxes, yes.
Yeah. There are plenty of other taxes.
Yeah, plenty of other taxes that we were all willingly paying.
Okay.
But the taxation system worked a little different than it does now. Because
Thank you for that history lesson, because I really didn't know, but okay. Thank you.
Go ahead. Kevin, don't you have something to throw in?
Not really. I'm somewhat speechless. I mean, to me, it's no different than anywhere else in the world. So it's a topic that we're looking at to say that at one point in time they were booming and now that they're not. It's just like they say, every empire has its rise, every empire has its fall. Every empire is on top at one point in time and every empire is on the bottom. So when you really look at it, they're just down and out right now because of what you just said. Their economy crashed and they're trying to figure their way out like everybody else. Right now, most of the stuff you see in America that we buy every day says made in China. Will China still be there in 15 or 20 years? I don't think they will be, but it's yet to be seen. So it's kind of like shooting blanks, if you will.
Well, I think the points that you just brought up are going to work very well in our next segment, because this is what makes this article so important, is the things that you just brought up and the bigger picture on how all of this interacts with each other. We are, in the next segment, we're going to get into why is it the world is buying everything from China now, and what does that do to the old superpowers, and how all that plays out. Because there's 7 stages of empires that we're going to talk about.
Okay, very good. We'll be back in just a moment with more of the broad perspective. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hello, I am His Majesty the Soul, King of Mauritius, and I invite you to help me build the world's planetary egg, an ecological geophysical galleon. It's approximately 180 acres, and it is home to 3,000 researchers from around the world. It is the world's first sovereign, planetary, independent jurisdiction that has the capability of advancing and progressing and fast-tracking every aspect of innovation, helping us redefine what it means to be human in a new world. So check out our website. It's www.mauricii.com. MORACEAE.com. I look forward to seeing you, and please contribute, donate to the GoFundMe page. I look forward to meeting you, and let's build the planetary egg. Thank you.
Welcome back to The Broad Perspective on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Kamori.
I'm Greg Barnes.
I'm Kevin Lawson.
And I'm Laura Felice.
And there's so much to talk about. Before we took our break, Greg and Kevin were having a discussion, and Greg mentioned the 7 stages of empire. We've talked about it previously on The Broad Perspective, but I think for new listeners, or even for people like me that need a refresher course, Greg, give us a update on what the 7 stages of empire is about.
Not a problem. Kevin really tied this article into why these 7 stages are so important, because he said it's just a merry-go-round. It's cycles. Everything is just happening over and over again. But there's a reason for that, and that's what we're going to cover in these 7 stages right now. Every empire starts off with sound money, meaning that the currency that they use is backed by gold or silver, or some tangible asset that is actually having value to it. Now, looking back at our monetary history, the reason why the United States became a superpower is because in World War I, when Europe was at war, having its world war, and all the nations were focused on fighting, they neglected simple manufacturing for the population. In other words, clothes and food and all those resources were completely secondary towards war material. Everything was made for the war. So what happened is that those governments had to start buying outside to supply those regular services for their people while they were engaged in this war. But the United States, understanding money itself, wouldn't take their fiat currencies that weren't worth anything. The United States took payment for its exports in gold.
Oh, smart. Okay.
Right? Think about that for a minute. That's the most important part of this whole story.
Okay.
They took payment in gold, not fiat currencies. That's how Fort Knox got filled up. That's how the United States, after World War I, accumulated over 8,000 tons of gold. Sliding into World War II, we go back into another world war, and the same thing was happening again. And so the United States was exporting goods. That's how we got to be the wealthy nation, is because we were exporting our goods and only taking payment in gold. And then we got in the war and accumulated a lot of debt, but we weren't using the gold to pay for it. We were it was just it was currency debt, right? But we weren't paying for everything with gold. Fast forward, the United States started taking all this wealth, and we're going into stage 2 now. Started taking all this wealth and creating social programs. Now, this should sound real familiar now. This is how we got Social Security. This is how we got the welfare programs. This is how we got retirement benefits, where the government was contributing to everyone's retirements so that when they could no longer work, society was going to contribute and take care of each other. Yeah,
yes,
to the well-being.
Okay.
And of course, stage 3 is when we start to go into military spending. Well, we have to make sure that no one can attack us because we're the wealthiest nation in the world now. So now we have to start allocating all these resources into protecting ourselves. And so this is how we began with the military industrial complex, where we were building up and building up and building up our military. All of this should sound really familiar to everyone right now. Stage 4 is war. It's self-explanatory. Now that we have all this military might, now we have to start using it.
You have to justify it.
To justify having it, we have to start engaging in war, or at least create situations or manufacture crises that make us believe that we need to be at war. Sounds like Syria and Iran and Iraq and Libya and all these places where we're at war, but we're not officially at war, but we're out using all this military equipment. Stage 5. In 1971, President Nixon took this country off of the gold standard completely because France realized that all of the currency that the United States was using to pay its bills wasn't really worth anything, and they had a gold window, they called it, where countries could take the US dollars and they could cash them in for gold because the United States had all this gold. But countries around the world started immediately transferring all of the US dollars they had and using it to gold, and that was depleting our resources of gold. So as an emergency measure, August 15th, 1971, President Nixon came on TV and said, the gold window is closed. We are off the gold standard now, and we are just going to use currency. Well, basically what that did was that put the rest of the world on a fiat currency monetary system as well. So every nation's currency was no longer backed by gold, because then it wouldn't be able to compete.
Okay, so let me ask then, why? Why did the rest, are they just copycats? Or did they think this was a smart thing to do, was to take it off the gold standard?
It has to do with imports and exports.
Okay.
How we pay our bills. And so this is where, if I have a high standard of monetary system, meaning my currency is worth a whole lot of money, then that means people can't afford to buy imports and exports or imports from me. Mm-hmm. And vice versa, it also allows them to buy whatever they want because their gold is worth more than my fiat currency, so they can actually come in and just buy up my entire country. And this is where this term tariffs come in, because tariffs are like the equalizer.
Okay.
Your currency is valued so much higher, so now to compensate that, I'm going to charge you X amount of dollars on anything that you bring to my country, right? It's an equalizer in currency transfers. Mm-hmm. So next stage is stage 6, where inflation comes in, because the currency isn't worth anything, but everyone has to pay their bills. And like we talked about earlier, you have this capitalist system where it has to create more debt than the previous year for it to stand up. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it implodes on its own weight, and you get stagnation and not deflation, but depression, mm-hmm. like we did in the 1930s. Everything went to a complete standstill stop. No one trusted anyone with credit, and if you didn't hold it, you didn't own it, and that was that. We went back to the 1800s immediately, overnight. So this is where now we come into Japan. This is what has happened. Japan has been paying all its bills and supporting all these fancy corporations, because remember, the rule is in capitalism, I have to make more money this year than I did last year. If not, my stockholders don't get paid, my stock price goes down, I lose my job, and the rest is history. Company goes under, right? We hear this all the time. So Japan has been doing just that, but they've done it for 3 decades now, where their central bank has been buying up all the retirement bonds. It's been buying up all the corporate buybacks to keep their stock market propped up, and everything's just in a complete bubble. Their real estate's in a bubble. Their car manufacturers in a bubble. Their phone manufacturing is all in a bubble. And so now it's no longer sustainable because there isn't any more debt for their central bank to buy. And so everything is stopping on a dime because they can't meet that simple equation of making more than I had the year before, or in fancy terms, creating more debt than I had the year before. And this is the reason why now they've had to start stealing everyone's retirements and breaking the social program promises that they can no longer afford.
Are you speaking strictly of Japan?
Strictly of Japan,
Okay.
But that's just the example from this
Okay.
article. But
Okay.
this is what is happening around the world.
I'm starting to see little pieces of that happen here too. You're starting to hear it being talked about.
Yes, because if anyone takes just 5 minutes and looks at the health of the pension system in America, and you can go state by state, 75% of all the states are completely underwater and cannot afford to pay their pension obligations.
There's a lot of social media support for being down on a lot of our social programs right now, pensions and welfare and everything. So basically what this is we're being programmed to accept that if we do away with these programs, we'll all be okay. And the truth is it's not going to solve the problem at all.
Well, yeah, okay. So, having said that, what do you do with the elderly who are no longer able to work? What do you do with people that are on welfare and really have had no work experience? And what do you do with the reduction in jobs? I know we're being told that there's such an increase in jobs, which I refuse to bite into that carrot. I just don't see that at all. And what do we do as these jobs disappear and people have nothing? Is this where basic income comes in, which is a whole other subject? But anyway, I don't want to go down it. Go ahead, Laura.
That is a whole different subject, but that's not what I wanted to respond
Go for
to.
it.
I think the governmental and political solution is go watch the movie Soylent Green.
Yeah. Okay.
Really, because
Okay.
so much of what's going on in that movie, and that's a pretty old movie, is already happening today.
Well, and that's what we're talking. That's what our show next week is going to be about: aging, and are we running to the grave? Are we keeping ourselves alive too long? But that's what is happening in places like Japan, why we have elderly people going into prison because they have no economic means of support, which I don't understand. I would have thought there would have been some sort of social program for the elderly in Japan, but I don't know. But that's why they're going into prison to have their needs met. So, but that's still a tax on the society because it costs to have money in prison. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about the third richest economy. I just went on Investopedia.com, cross-referenced. There was a few different sites like Forbes magazine and other business sites, and they're documented to be the third richest economy in the world right now. Which
Okay.
we're talking about
Interesting.
Japan.
Okay.
Now, China's also ranked on there. You have the United States ranked above them. Right under them is Germany, the United Kingdoms, India, France, Brazil, Italy, and then number 10 is Canada. But let's be clear, they're talking about economies, not richest countries. Okay, so you're saying people are going into prison.
Okay.
People are going into prison because they have the option.
Ah.
Okay, because when you scroll down on these different sites, and it's all the same, I've cross-referenced it on Forbes and everything else, they're documenting the richest country right now to be Qatar. Meaning, this country has more money, but people in that country don't have the option to just say, I'm old, I can't get benefits, I'm just going to go to prison. Why? Because when you steal in those countries, you lose a limb. It's a different system. So when you have the option to say, well, I want 3 hots and a cot, I'm just going to go to prison because I'm old and I don't have the services and I have nobody to look to, so I'm going to break your window and wait for the police to come get me. You're taking advantage of a democratic society in which you know is going to support its citizens.
Okay, but Qatar has a program that supports its citizens, so there's no need to break a window to go to prison.
They
do.
have a program to support its citizens, but again, we're talking about an economy that's rich. You see what I'm saying? Now we're talking about, like I said, they may be the richest country. They're not the richest economy.
But isn't that what determines whether a country's rich or not?
No.
Is the
Well,
economy?
I think this is
Okay, go for it,
an
Greg.
extremely good point that we do have time to address it. If you look at basic accounting, it's not how much money you have, it's what is your net. It's not what is your gross, it's what's your net.
Right.
So when you say richest countries in the world, they're not balancing the gross versus the expenses
Okay.
and then coming up with a net. And that's where the illusion of wealth is being put into our minds that we're wealthy.
Not only that, they're not giving it to their economy. When you have an economy, Japan is giving money. The United States gives money to the people. Like you said, you have social programs. Our money, though we pay taxes, goes to the people. It goes to the elderly. It goes to the sick. It goes back to the people. However, when you have other places that don't, the money's not circulating through the economy, say, as fast or as much, then of course when you're, like you were pointing out about the empires, when your money is backed by a natural resource, predominantly oil, you are of course going to thrive more. To whereas here in America, we don't really have those natural resources. Japan's really going through a thing with natural resources. So when you're looking at all these quote unquote rich economies, we have a lot of stuff going on. We're constantly outsourcing, insourcing, but there's no real value in our dollar.
That's right.
There's nothing backing
gotcha.
us.
All those top world economies, those are all debt economies.
Yes.
Exactly, because
Yes.
that's
Those are
what I'm
debt
saying. They're
economies.
steadily, like he was pointing out, democracy is steadily shelling out debt, and the economy is flourishing. Why? Because everybody can say that, oh, we have a little bit, or we have benefits, or like Canada, we have free health care. But in all actuality, everybody's broke, everybody's struggling, everybody's going through it. To whereas when you look at these quote unquote rich countries, all you got to do is pay attention to the citizens and how they're doing and what they're saying.
Interesting. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back with more of the broad perspective. Stay tuned.
The 12th hour.
A show literally about everything.
Everything.
A candid discussion between friends about their different perspectives on what they think may be going on.
Or what is not going on.
With so many different areas of information being given out, we attempt to put together the puzzle pieces to create the broad perspective of the whole picture.
Welcome back to the Broad Perspective on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Kamori.
I'm Donovan Hurd.
I'm Greg Barnes.
I'm Kevin Lawson.
And I'm Laura Felice.
And during our break, Donovan had a question which I have asked him to reiterate, or some thoughts while we're on the air, because they were perfect with what we're talking about. So do you remember, Donovan, what we were talking about?
I think
or what
I do.
you were
I'll give
talking
it a
about?
shot.
Go for it.
My question was, I wanted to know. Initially, I wanted to know why, if everyone knows, in the as far as economics are concerned, and as far as money is concerned, and the banking system and the gold standard, that inevitably that particular system is bound to fail based on its construction. Why would other countries adopt the ideology or the economic ideologies that we share, or that we share with them via the systems that we had? So apparently that was forced upon the other countries in order to compete. But if that's the case, then we would all have to realize and recognize that inevitably this bubble that we're in, these financial and economic issues that we're having right now, are bound to be worsened, and we're bound to collapse. Not just the United States. I'm talking about everyone who's adopted this particular ideology economically. We're bound to collapse, and so knowing that, maybe we should, as a people, country, or other countries, figure out ways that we can change the underpinnings and the underlining way that economics are done, or that the banking system is ran, or whatever, so that we can eventually have something left for our children and their children's children, because as it stands right now, there is absolutely no hope for any country based on the standards that we have economically right now.
I agree. Go ahead, Greg.
I'd like to address a couple points you made. And one is, you talked about nations, why would they adopt this system, this economic system? And you're right, it was because they had to compete. But it was also, like you did address, it was forced upon them. This is the reason why the United States has had all of these covert savior wars where they're spreading freedom and democracy, but what they're really spreading is their economic system. They're forcing countries to adopt the US dollar as their underlying currency to do their business under the point of a gun. You will use this or else. And this is the reason why we have the United States, 209 countries, and the United States has military bases in 182 of them. What does that tell you about who the United States is when you look at it from that perspective?
It tells you United States can only bully those who allow it, period. Because those countries that we're talking about that are thriving aren't playing this game. See, that's the thing. You're talking about countries that adopted it. It's not about, it's colonialism, period, point blank. That's all it boils down to. All these countries that we can name, it's colonialism. America came, or some type of Western civilization came, put its foot in the ground and said, I'm staking claim for this land to be mine, even though it belonged to somebody else.
What foreign country has bases here in the United States?
Well, no foreign country has bases in the United States because of the
exactly.
fact that
That's what
really
I'm saying.
the United States is not going to allow a war to be fought on their land. We fought our own war on our land, but we've never allowed another country to fight a war on our land. But if you look at the United States and why we won't fight a war on our land, it's because the United States can't afford it. We cannot afford to rebuild. We can afford to blow up other countries and go spend money on plywood and maybe some brick, but we cannot afford to, let's say, rebuild New York or have New York look like Germany in World War II.
Look what we're doing with the tornadoes and the hurricanes and everything. We're not getting these areas that have been hit rebuilt like back to their original places.
No.
I would agree with that, and that's my point. So
Yeah.
now let's take a B-52
Right.
and let's drop bombs. And like I said, let's make New York or any other metropolitan area, downtown LA or wherever you want to place it at, Chicago, and let's make it look like World War II. And we're not gonna come back.
Go for it, Laura.
But if you look at the one that comes to mind specifically is Hurricane Katrina. A lot of what was destroyed were low-income areas. None of that low-income housing was rebuilt. All those people that lived there that were displaced or permanently displaced because they can't afford to live where they've lived their whole lives because low-income housing
Okay, but
wasn't
then
built.
ask yourself this: why? Let's be honest and let's cut through it. Low-income housing didn't get rebuilt because who of prestigious background wants low-income housing around them, lowering their property value?
Right.
Let's just be honest. The money that goes to rebuild it comes from those that have it. People that are poor are always going to be poor, and they don't have the money to, let's say, rebuild their home that they've had in their family for generations that their great-great-great-grandfather built. They just don't have it. That's why Detroit went through what they went through when they were selling houses for pennies, literally. So it comes back to what we know to be the truth. There is a problem in America. Money is the problem. And if you have money, you have control. And that's what this system is about, even in Japan. If you have money, you have control. If you don't have money, you're not in control. And when you say that I'm 84 and make a decision to say, okay, well, I would rather be in jail where I know for sure I'm getting fed, where I know for sure if I get sick I have health care, where I know for sure I have a roof over my head. That is a powerful statement to make, to say I'm 84 years old and I'm going to put myself in a predicament where I'm not guaranteed to come home, whether it be for the slightest thing like cancer or the biggest thing like AIDS. Because all of that stuff is in jail. You have, I wouldn't call them victims, but you have patients that have AIDS and cancer in jail and are getting treated for it. So I wonder now, with what we look at as an economy again, why do you not see this happening in countries that dollars is backed by natural resources. It's because they're not sharing it with their economy. They're keeping it. It's part of the reason we put Muammar Gaddafi out of power. The man's net worth when he died was, I think, $180 billion. His death literally changed the global economy. I mean,
Well, how could it? Because it would transfer down to his heirs, wouldn't it?
No, they killed his heirs too.
Oh,
They killed his son and his daughter.
but there's still the wealth that goes somewhere.
They killed his son first, then they
Doesn't
killed
matter.
his daughter, then they killed him, and then they had a whole nother regime come into power.
But their wealth has to go somewhere.
Where? Where's it going to go
Well,
if you don't have
are
any
you
heirs?
telling? Oh, it'll go somewhere. The state will take it.
That's my point. His country took it.
Oh, okay,
And
okay,
that's what I'm
okay,
saying. But it changed the
okay.
whole global economy because, like we've just been pointing out, all of a sudden, the United States allowed Libya to come to the United Nations, and now you have a seat and a voice. All of a sudden, you got a seat and a voice. Why? Because it's $180 billion floating around in your economy. Of course, we love you. Come on in.
Well, I'm going to go back to something you said, Kevin. You said if you have money, you have power. If you don't have money, you don't have power. But most of the world is on a fiat currency. So what kind of power is it that
Yeah,
they have?
that's a good
It's an
question.
illusion.
That's a very good
Their
question.
power is
Yeah.
an
No,
illusion.
Most of the Western world
Okay.
is on the fiat currency.
currency.
Because most of the Arab world is not on a fiat
Yes,
currency.
it
that's,
is.
Okay, let's
Very
talk
small.
about let's talk about this. Who do you know right now has challenged Saudi Arabia right now?
Okay, let me answer that for you. First, with a correction. Every single country in the world is operating on a fiat currency
Yes.
right now. Every single country. They
Yes.
are all playing the game because they have to, because of international trade. Two, the reason why Saudi Arabia is what it is because it is the leader of the OPEC nation, in which Henry Kissinger, between 74 and 76, created the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia so that the OPEC nations that sell oil in the world only sell their oil in U.S. dollars.
Right.
That's the reason why Saudi Arabia is what it is. Without that agreement, Saudi Arabia would be Iraq or Iran or anything else.
You can't say Iran because Iran is a superpower that everybody worries about. You can't say that. That's my point. You could say to Saudi Arabia, you could talk about this fiat currency you guys keep mentioning and them using the dollar. But at the end of the day, what you just said clears up my whole point. You cannot deal with that country unless you deal with them the way they want. They might be playing your game to make you think that you're going to buy oil. But how am I telling you that, hey, I'm going to use your dollar for you to spend with me so that I regenerate it, but I'm going to overcharge you for the oil? So I'm not really using your money. I'm just bringing it into my country so that you can use it so I can give you change for the money you're
But you have to
spending.
understand the petrodollar, which is about ready to change. But nonetheless, this is the way it's always been. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay, I just want to jump in and make a small correction. You are correct with Iran. Iran does not use the petrodollar, nor does South Korea. That is the reason why they are on the list
Oh,
of
yes.
those nations
That's
that
right.
are rogue nations that won't play ball with the United States.
South Korea or
the
North Korea?
North Korea.
North Korea.
That's the reason why they're on the hit list, right? Now,
Isn't there one? Isn't there a third?
there was a third.
Okay.
They're playing ball now. But going back to what we're just talking about is that this is the reason why on March 26th, when the yuan oil futures trading contract goes into play, is why it's going to change the economic system as we understand it, because it is going to completely undermine the petrodollar agreement where all countries have to buy oil using U.S. dollars.
So I would point out this again. At the end of the day, no matter what piece of paper you print to say that we have to use this, the petrodollar, anything else you want to mention, whatever piece of paper you use, if I'm in control of the oil, you have to pay me, right? That's all I'm saying. You have to pay me. So if I decide to cut off your water to say that, you know what, we're not selling oil anymore, it would cause a war.
But
Would
you
it
may not be able to. Yes, but the problem is you may not be able to sell it. The problem is a lot of countries now have found their own oil reserves. That's why the price of oil went down so far. It's being manipulated again right now. But that if you have something, you have to understand there has to be a market for it. No matter what you've got, there's got to be a want for it. And if oil is in short supply, then yes, you've got some manipulation power. But if it's not, then you don't. So you might just be sitting on a glut of oil.
Like Venezuela.
Like Venezuela. Exactly.
They are a huge oil producing
Yes.
nation, but why are
And they're
they
sitting on it.
Why are they completely starving to death over
Because
there?
like I just said, it's still about you're gonna play my game. It does, like you said, America puts bases in strategic places. Why? It's because of our influence. It's because we're playing the game to say that we're gonna put a base in your country because you like us and you love us, and that's the facade we put up. But in all actuality, it's a power thing. So Saudi Arabia plays the same game. So does Iran, and so does everybody else that produces oil. What you just said, it's a manipulation game. It's not just about the oil. It's a trade embargo there that we're not seeing. Right now, pharmaceutical companies have soared for the last 10 years with opiates.
Right.
Soared. It's native to these Arab nations. That's what grows there. That's what's harvested there. So are we looking at everything, or are we just looking at oil? What I'm saying is trade, as far as us and China, is a big deal. As far as us and Saudi Arabia, is a big deal. Our trade with them far outweighs, hey, well, look, Venezuela, we'll make a deal because you're going to sell us oil for cheaper. We'll just get it from you for cheaper, but then we're going to make Saudi Arabia mad, so they're going to cut us off from everything else. It's a power game. And as long as, what I'm saying is, they're still not taking that money and cycling it back through their economy, and that's keeping the rich rich and the poor poor. That's why you see such a big gap between their rich and the poor. What you do here in America, don't get me wrong, you see our rich rich and our poor poor, but we still have I don't even want to call them a middle class. I call them right above poverty comfortable, where they can own stuff and still have a dream, to whereas there you're poor and you probably will never own anything. You can't even go to school a lot of times because you have to pay for it, and a lot of them can't afford to pay for it. So are we playing the game, or are we being colonist?
Well, playing the game is being colonist. That's what
Yes.
the structure
Yeah.
is.
That's
Exactly.
I mean,
That's very true.
I know we've said this before on this show, but I think it bears repeating for people that are newer listeners, is the game of Monopoly was invented by a man who wanted to show how bad capitalism was, and that it would always fail. That is what we are seeing now. Capitalism is bought and sold on the dreams of people that want more, want to sit at the tables with the big players, and that becomes self-feeding, and people get addicted to power. And what we're seeing now is the clash of titans. That is exactly what is happening, the clash of titans, and it's probably going to get far worse before it gets better.
Well, I think we're all learning in the process.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Also, most democracies, I recently found out, end up being dictatorships.
Yeah, that's
Who
true.
do you want as your dictator? Do you want Trump as your dictator?
Well, we'll talk about that when we come back. We'll be right back with more of The Broad Perspective. Stay tuned.
BPN. Join the awakening.
The Broad Perspective Network is a portal designed to reveal a new perspective and reality to those who wish to know the truth about the world we live in and our role in it.
BPN. See beyond the illusion.
Welcome back to The Broad Perspective on the Broad Perspective Network. I'm Vivian Kamori.
Donovan Hurd.
I'm Greg Barnes.
I'm Kevin Lawson.
And I'm Laura Felice.
And this is the concluding segment of today's show. Interesting discussion here. Greg, we still need to finish up the 7 stages of empire because we're going to be out of time and we'll forget to do that. So go for it.
When we left off at stage 6, where
Yes.
inflation, or the cost of living, starts to get outrageous. There are perfect examples of inflation if you look at Venezuela, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Portugal. You can see what hyperinflation looks like. This is when they are printing so much money that it's completely devaluing the currency that exists already, which in fancy words is removing or reducing your purchasing power. That's the reason why the $100 you spend at the grocery store only gets you a quarter of a basket now, when 20 years ago, that same $100 would get you the full basket of groceries. And then we move on to the more fine-tuned details of stage 6, and we'll call it 6.1, where everyone starts to wake up and understand this financial system like we're doing now and educating everyone, and they start to lose faith in the banking system, meaning they stop keeping their money in the bank, they stop using the banks for their regular transactions. And that itself causes another problem, because now liquidity is or lack of liquidity is caused in banks. And so now when you have the people that do have money in the bank decide that they want to take it out, then they can no longer do that because the money is in everyone's mattresses. And all of that results in a reduction in the value of the currency itself. If you look at, we talked about Venezuela in past shows. 5 years ago, Venezuela was at a ratio of 9 bolivars to $1 US. Now it is 246,000 bolivars to make $1 US. That's what hyperinflation looks like, people.
Yep.
But every empire goes through this exact same process. Then you get to where people can't afford to do anything, and that causes a chaos in the streets. You see that in Mexico. You see that in Venezuela, Greece. You hear about the riots and all this stuff. All this stuff is going on, happening right before us, but because we're only focused on the United States, we don't see it happening. It's going to start happening everywhere more frequently. This is the reason why they have all these distractive things going on in society, so that you don't pay attention to these things.
Exactly. Diversion.
That's right. And of course, after the chaos starts in the street, then here's where the government, in its efforts to maintain its credibility and the facade that it is here to protect you, is when they start to roll out the police state, known as martial law, where they start to control the streets using the military. Now, for those that haven't been following, this is what all the surveillance is all about, and the drones and the new military vehicles that the police have and all of this stuff.
For our protection.
It's all for our protection.
Air quotes.
No, they are slowly building, covertly, preparations for what they know is going to happen in this failing economic system, which is martial law.
Now, is this still 6 point something, or is that 7?
No, this is 6.6 is where we are right now.
Okay.
And so right now, this is where, when society breaks down and everything becomes like a Skid Row situation, where now people are bartering goods and services. No one's ever using money anymore because it's not worth a damn, or nobody even has the wheelbarrows that it takes to carry, 246,000 bolivars
Exactly.
to any kind of store that doesn't have anything in it, because it's either been burned down or closed down because nobody's delivering to it, right? And the system just breaks down. Long story short, society ends up having to restructure itself. The biggest bubble pops, which is the population bubble, because so many people are not prepared for this. They go by the wayside. And society gets smaller, and it has to restructure itself and then rebuild itself. And then the cycle starts all over again.
Okay, so is that number 7?
That was number 7.
Okay, so what would you title that one? The bubble pops?
No, that would actually be the complete transfer of wealth, where all the money from the poor actually goes to all the super wealthy, and then the super wealthy restart the system again.
So you would be then validating my point that every empire has its rise and every empire has its fall, and those that are in power right now are already super wealthy. They're not sharing with the poor. So like Donovan once pointed out earlier in the show, you have no way to correct it because it's inevitable. But if you're there, in other words, the people that we're talking about that are super rich right now in these other countries that, like you said, aren't playing the game, they already have seen it so many times that they're just not playing anymore. They're literally just keeping the money and letting their citizens starve.
Hello, can you say French Revolution? Do you remember what happened in the French Revolution?
Yeah.
They were the big old guillotine wheeled down the road.
Okay, and you had that, and that's true, and you've had several countries revolt and everything else, but you've never had a country revolt with a type of military superpower that we have. Like you pointed out, martial law. Let's look at some of our history just for a second. Let's just look at something recent, I guess you could say. Let's look at the riots of '92. They had no way to stop it. Police were scared. Its citizens were scared. They didn't know what to do. So what they do? They brought the military in, and everything ceased and desisted immediately. Now, fast forward, all these years later, was it about 25 years later, 26 years later? You fast forward, military personnel are no longer those same soldiers that marched in there and stood tall. And no, military personnel now are a lot more dangerous, a lot more trained, a lot more accurate, a lot more subtle. And our police are militarized now to where they might not even get that far. Mm-hmm. Because if they do call the military in today's society, it's going to be far worse because of the fact that our police force is already military. Our police force already has tanks, automatic weapons, shields, riot gear, helicopters, and everything else. Whereas they didn't have that then. They didn't have all that technology.
Well, that was the whole point. If I could make a little correction in what you said. If we go back in history, you said that there's never been a situation where the military might was like the United States has. Well, that'd be incorrect. The Roman Empire would be the living example of dominating the world.
The
basically.
Roman Empire had swords,
and it imploded on itself.
Listen,
but it's
the
all
Roman
relative.
Empire had swords. I'm talking about the
But
military
it was
might.
relative.
But here's
to
the-
this.
This is what I'm saying. Right now, go get 100,000 citizens. Right now, put them in any city you want to name. Give them guns, give them weapons, and everything you're talking about. Now, in the Roman Empire, them was 100,000. The French Revolution, Haiti, all of them, they could win because it's an equal fight. It's a fight on the ground that everybody has to present themselves for to win this battle. You have to overthrow an actual place. But in today's society, we don't have to do any of that. We launch a few Scud missiles, like you were talking about those drones, these planes that we got flying. You launch a few missiles, 100,000 gone within 20 minutes. Gone.
That is true.
Okay, I
It's
see
what
your
I'm saying is
point.
we
but
don't have to fight.
I see your point, but I'm saying that it's all relative because Rome in its day, it had the most
Right.
Innovative weaponry of all the nations.
And it still got defeated by Persia.
It did not get defeated by Persian. It imploded upon itself for the exact same reason that we're talking now.
Right.
It imploded economically
Yes.
first. And that is why you got the Ottoman Empire, which is known as Persia, because they came in and walked into the Dark Ages and took over.
After they'd already imploded
they
economically.
had already imploded, and they just walked in and took everything.
Well, we've got a nice walk down history here. We're about out of time, so we've got about a minute left to say something encouraging to folks. I don't have much to say in that vein.
Well, I do.
Okay, go for it.
It's all about economic understanding. We try to, some of this stuff seems boring at times, but the economic history is vital to understanding what is happening in modern day age. Because every single war has always been an economic war. It has never been about freedom, democracy, civil rights,
Right.
none of that.
None of it.
None of that. It's always been an economic war.
Even though it may have been sold to the people for all the reasons that you mentioned.
Exactly.
Right, because that's how you get people to support your ambitions.
Exactly.
So we want to tie this back into Japan somehow. We just watch the signs, and when you have your elderly citizens committing crimes, small though they are, just so they can have a roof over their head and food on the table, I guess it's a sign to pay attention that things they are changing.
I said take care of your own. You see your elderly struggling, take care of your own.
Thank
What's a
you.
meal? What's one meal? Old people don't even eat that much anyway.
This is true, and we're going to talk about that in greater detail in next week's show, because we're going to talk about running to the grave, and we are keeping our elderly alive longer than usual, so next week we'll tackle that. In the meantime, thanks everybody for tuning in today. Join us same time, same place next week, where it's all perspective. Join us and broaden yours. Thank you so much for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed today's show. To keep programs like this and other programs on the Broad Perspective Network, go to thebroadperspective.com and click the donate button. We truly appreciate your support.